Good evening. This is Mae Brussell on KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. It's broadcast number 615, September 19th, 1983. I want to begin the broadcast by apologizing for tape number 612. There was no way to know that it was defective when it went out. I did that broadcast on Monday, August 29th, and left about 7:15 the next morning to go up to Vancouver, Canada. And I was gone until the weekend when I came back and did the next broadcast, and I had no way of knowing that it was defective, and the judgment of the tape center was to send it out as is because a lot of people wanted and expected it to arrive. And if you have one that is objectionable, if it's defective, if there's a flaw, there's something wrong with the switchboard here at KZU. We're having trouble taking the tape from the machinery cassette off the air. The switches are jumbled and giving us problems. And if it offends you and you want a complete clean set, I'm going to do that broadcast over for the cassettes because they go out regularly back broadcast, and I don't want anything in that condition. And particularly each week it's very important to have the proper sound and the proper quality. That's tape number 612. Send it back if you want, and we'll replace it with one that I'll do over. While I was in Canada, I went up to see Johnny Meyer. He worked for the Howard Hughes organization for 6 years, and then at the time of the Watergate, when the links of Howard Hughes to Richard Nixon's administration was falling apart, he switched sides and went to the Democrats and George McGovern and various people offering them information of the politicians he paid off. Unfortunately, the Democrats were paid as much as the Republicans, and so they gave him the cold shoulder, and he testified before the Senate Committee on Watergate. And as a result of that, in 1974, he was framed and swept into a group of sleazy people, and there were plenty of them in the Hughes organization, who entrapped him to a situation, and particularly a German, a Nazi, who came over to Canada, Ehrenfried Lubitsch, Ehrenfried Lubich. A group of people got him. It is swept into a video corporation deal and took life insurance on a man, Alfred Wayne Neuter, and Netter was murdered in 1974, November 74, just when the Watergate story was really unfolding. And Johnny's been charged with that murder, and he's going to be extradited from Canada to Los Angeles. I went up there to see if I could help him and took extensive notes on the early court records and so forth, and have been following this case for a long, long time. I didn't want to broadcast till I saw him. And when the Korean air flight settles down, as do many other matters, such as Jonestown or Watergate or the assassinations of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, all these events get put on the shelf of history to be mangled and dissected later. When this all dies down, I'll tell you about Johnny Meyer and his contacts in Liechtenstein and the connections to the various scandals that are going on now, and his trial will be taking place in Los Angeles. As I went to the station last night, I heard on the news that Mark Rich was indicted for a $48 million tax evasion case. I guess that'll be in the newspapers soon. I was saying it was $20 million. He's the secret owner that bought 50% of 20th Century Fox from along with Marvin Davis. He bought half of the studio, and I've been following that scandal every week. So his indictment took place just yesterday, or today rather. The broadcast 1 year ago today, we always update that. That was broadcast 563, September 20th, 1982. Last year I was talking about the Italian extradition, the requested Licio Gelli, dual citizenship between Switzerland and Argentina. He was caught at a Swiss bank checking out many millions, $46 million. I forget the exact figure because various accounts differ. But he was arrested in Switzerland and was to be sent to Italy for trial, and just the week that he was supposed to be sent, he walked out this past year out of the jail, and he's back in Argentina. Also, a year ago, there were the first links of the secret Masonic lodge that Gelli was the head of, and the Italian Banco Ambrosiano that Roberta Calvi was president of, and he was murdered in June of '82. 1 year later, there were links of the Masonic Lodge to Banco Ambrosiano, to the worldwide Nazis, to Klaus Barbie, to narcotics traffic, to gun running, and the Vatican, and all of a sudden they all came together. They've been historically linked for years, but the evidence in the court trials is, of course, bringing this closer together. Last year, the situation in Lebanon was that Mr. Begin was assisting the Gemayel family to help clean out the PLO and the Syrians out of Lebanon. Gemayel and Begin are part of the Grand Mufti's team. The Gemayel family was selected as co-partners of the Grand Mufti, who at the time of World War II was working closely with Adolf Hitler. Begin worked with the Gemayel family, the Mafia, the Nazis, all worked together in Lebanon. 1 year later, Begin has resigned. He's a broken, sad man, and the U.S. troops are escalating a war in Lebanon, opposing any factor that does not want the Christian Gemayel family in power. The airline story is, of course, the number one story of the year, and I'll go right to that because many of you are interested in it. 2 weeks ago, when the Korean airline had just gone down, it went down September the 1st, I did a broadcast that next Monday, and last week I did work on the John Kennedy assassination for you. So now we have a 2-week perspective to look back on that airline event. I said that it was a diversionary from our allies that are in very bad trouble. The trouble continues in the Philippines, where they object to Mr. Marcos and Ronald Reagan's visit there. There's problems in Pakistan with PIA. The Wall Street Journal this past 2 weeks have had articles on the tremendous debts of South America and Brazil as far as solidarity. And I mentioned the Polish problems there. Lech Walesa said this week, let's give it another name, go underground, have different groups. Solidarity for all purposes is dead. That was the CIA in Poland, and that didn't work. I also said it was a diversionary from 9 major investigations and lawsuits, but one of them that I put on the list, the Los Angeles Police Department defended against the American Civil Liberties Union. I'll spend the greater part of this evening talking about that. That one won't wash away, and I put that number 1, numero uno, because of the Larry MacDonald military and mafia connections, and that is what, maybe by wiping out Larry MacDonald, some of the pieces of evidence would not have to surface, or hopefully they would believe that. Mark Rich was one of the people I mentioned that listed 2 weeks ago that was under investigation. He is surfacing now. None of these items that I mentioned on the air as investigations that touch Western goals and Larry MacDonald ever will wash away, and there will be writers and researchers, as there are now, working on all these different facets and trying to put them together. Now, I asked the question 2 weeks ago, if it were a provocation, what would the purpose be, who would gain from it, and how would they do it? And I listed the ways the provocation takes place, and next week I'm going to go over again what I said 2 weeks ago, the 11 ways to carry this thing off if it was a United States provocation, and then give you more supporting evidence 2 weeks later to back up those items that I have on broadcast number 613. That was September the 5th. One important party that I mentioned in Colorado that I think is instrumental to triggering this great international scandal was that party in Colorado of the Deposed Monarchy. I refer to the Deposed Monarchy with Henry Kissinger that met the day before the plane actually crashed. It was the evening of the 30th, reported on September the 1st. Helmut Schmidt, Gerald Ford, Giscard D'Estaing, James Callahan from Great Britain, Malcolm Fraser from Australia, all of them meeting at Vail, Colorado, all with common denominations to common links, rather, to the current investigations, the missing money, the Nazi connections, the narcotics, the Larry MacDonald operations. And I compared their meeting to the one that was held at Murchison's home the night before John Kennedy was murdered, with the orders to go ahead. That plane was held 45 minutes. Larry MacDonald was on it. The other congressmen and people going to Southeast Asia or Korea were on separate airplanes. We don't know what kind of people were with Larry MacDonald. If they were spies, we don't really have their names or any identification, and we probably never will know. But one of the things I mentioned about the Deposed Monarchs on this particular trip with Henry Kissinger in Colorado. I call that a trip because they all came from other countries to meet with Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger. Also on the board of 20th Century Fox, where Mark Rich is now indicted, that's 50% owner of their corporation, $40 million of American taxes or 45 overseas. Now, David Emery pointed out, he's a researcher, puts on the radio programs up north on 2 other stations. He pointed out from Covert Action of March 1982 that there was a long article about the invasion of the Seychelles Islands, and that involved our top CIA people that worked with Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford and Michael Hoare, Hoare, and Covert Action in March 1982 mentions the arms smuggling and the terrorists and the invasion of Seychelles starting from South Africa with the help of the Nazi and the Broderband group. And the bodyguard for Giscard d'Estaing, Olivier Danet, D-A-N-E-T, was one of the people involved in the Seychelles operation over in the Indian Ocean. Covert Action, March 82, mentions that the bodyguard for Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the former premier of France, Olivier Danet, was one of the people involved in the arms smuggling and terrorism, not only in Paris, but with the Seychelles Island in 1982. This came from Covert Action, March 1982, page 7. His co-partner with that invasion over at that island in the Indian Ocean was Michael Hoare, H-O-A-R-E. And if you get counter-spy in the spring of 1976, Michael Hoare is linked with the CIA, with Richard Allen, with Henry Kissinger, with the overthrow of the Portuguese government to put in the right-wing government. He's linked with the Odessa network of Nazi Otto Skorzeny, with ITT and John McCone. See, McCone worked for Bechtel. It was Bechtel McCone, and McCone was the CIA director when Kennedy was killed. And McCone and George Shultz are very close, so that if the meeting in Madrid was to take place to discuss human rights and try to have some rapprochement with Russia and the rest of the world, Mr. Shultz, as part of the McCone-Bechtel-McCone gang and Secretary of State, walks out of the meeting and refuses to meet Gromyko. But he'll work with Michael Hoare. You see, the airline with 269 people went down. That bothers him. But I could list maybe hundreds or millions of deaths, up to several million, that these people have caused, and they don't blink an eyelash. Well, John McCone was mentioned in this article in Counterspy, and SDECE, that's the French military police, it's the counterpart of the KGB or the CIA for France. Also part of the group with Michael Hoare, and this would be Olivier Danet, is Prince Borghese, B-O-R-G-E-S-E. Prince Borghese is mentioned and is very much part of Permindex, the group that were behind the assassinations in the United States, and I mentioned before Larry MacDonald's role from Atlanta, Georgia, with these people in Roy Cohn, the Torbett document. If you don't have it, you should get it. It's available, I think it's $15. Research has it up in Aptos. It's reprinted from, it's a manuscript written by the lawyer who was attending the party at Murchison's when he heard the plans the night before, or allegedly had been there or was close to people who had been there when Kennedy was murdered. Prince Borghese worked with Michael Hoare, Herzogs von Valencia, Herzogs, and the fascist group, and also with Michael Hoare. They set up the guerrillas of Christ the King that came out of Spain, that Paladin group that I referred to on broadcast number 610 just several weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago. And Hoare works with Henry Kissinger and Richard Allen, and also out of the Azore Islands where they worked is a man, attorney named Edmund L. Demise, D-I-N-I-S. Demise was the district attorney at the time at Chappaquiddick when Senator Edward Kennedy had that accident off the bridge and Mary Jo Kopechne was dead. And that accident in 1969 ended the presidency, or the possibility of presidency, for Ted Kennedy running against Richard Nixon for 72. Tony Laswitz was up at that island, and Laswitz and G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt worked together. They also worked for Permindex, and they also worked for John McCone and the CIA director when Kennedy was killed, and for Otto Skorzeny. So the district attorney of the Chappaquiddick area that smears Ted Kennedy but doesn't bring in the evidence of the conspiracy or what Laswitz is doing there except smearing him, comes together with Michael Hoare. I mention this at length because, as I say, he is a partner in the invasion of the islands, the Seychelles Islands, with Olivier Danet, who is the bodyguard of Giscard d'Estaing. Now, one more reference to Danet that I had on my broadcast number 610, that complicated diagram that I gave you, those of you that subscribe to the tapes, of Eliseo Gelli, Henry Kissinger, the Monte Carlo Lodge, where a gentleman was revealing the background of the Bologna bombing, the train station in Italy, where 80 were killed, and then more, and then that were on top of that were killed. And the connections that I had on that broadcast were to Klaus Barbie and the Nazis, and Henry Kissinger and Klaus Barbie. And there were terror groups set up by the Odessa. One was the Guerrillas of Christ, the Spain, responsible for the bombings, as I say, in Italy. Now, these people have worked together through all kinds of violences, through the assassinations, through the organized crime syndicate. It was Ilio Ciolini, Ciolini, who was arrested. He was a financier who was arrested and testified regarding the links of 6 people who worked with Klaus Barbie, and those in turn worked with Henry Kissinger and Giscard d'Estaing and Gerald Ford and the whole gang. And one of those 5 was Olivier Danet, D-A-N-E-T. It was published in the British Guardian February 14th, 1983 by David Pallister, and it's, if you want to check it up, it's broadcast 610. So when I mentioned a high-level meeting of people involved in giving the final go on the Korean airline, that is what I mean. Now, Newsweek had a story about Reagan versus the New Right. He's disassociating himself from the New Right, but he isn't telling you how high up the Larry MacDonald Western Goals board of people are. He's keeping his arm's distance, but he's using Edward Teller, Admiral Moore, and Roy Cohn, who moved to Washington. Now he has headquarters in Washington as well as other areas. And this one article in Newsweek, September 19th, is a quotation of Lynn Nofziger on why Ronald Reagan is visibly staying his arm's distance away from the New Right. And Nofziger, who was his advisor and campaign manager before, said Reagan's longtime ambassador to the GOP's right wing said that he will trade backing off of the far right, the Larry MacDonald Group and the Birch Society, for broader mainstream support for the controversial MX missile, for defense spending, for military aid in Central America, and a variety of other issues linked by the president to the Korean air disaster. Well, I listed 7 of the variety of issues 2 weeks ago. I now have 27 motives or varieties that he's pulled. That you have to admit that this Reagan is an absolute genius. I mean, he just ties things together. He's so marvelous the way he does it. He almost deserves to have the job. He's so fantastic. But Newsweek is saying that he will use this for a variety of reasons, and hopefully next week I'll go through 27 that he's using it for so far. Many of you picked a lot of them up, like getting the nerve gas through in the MX missile and stop the nuclear freeze. How quickly it stopped the Democratic Party from talking about peace. How quickly one airplane that wasn't even analyzed or the instrument panels analyzed, they're willing to throw everything out just because this plane went down over an area that they were warned in advance they would blow it up, and they're willing to throw all of this out. Incidentally, getting back to the Korean airline and the old teams that always come in when there's a major CIA-provoked disaster, you can always gauge it. The first attorney on the job hired for the Korean airline problems, this is Newsweek, September 19th, is a picture of Melvin Belli. He's filed a class action suit in San Francisco on behalf of the relatives of the victims, and he's also suing Litton Industries, who manufactured the jet's navigational equipment. Now, Litton Industry is, if you read The Death of Democracy, among all their other jobs, it was a conduit for overthrowing Greece and putting in the military dictatorship with Tom Pappas of the CIA and Spiro Agnew, and they were planning to kill Richard Nixon, and in 1972, the Squad 19. They have been working with the far right for a long time, and this computerized airplane equipment, the airplane was made by Boeing, Senator Jackson's company. He was always a senator from Boeing. And the panels were made by Litton. So if the navigation was off and they go 300 miles in the Soviet Union, knowing that they're going to be offed, that is a provocation that indicates something to me about how Litton would want to create the situation for getting more of the weapons. Not only is Belli into this thing, but also Richard Veggery. Veggery gave one of the speeches, the big rallies, at the services. It wasn't services for Larry MacDonald. It was a political rite, like the Inquisition, getting their muscles ready. Vagary was working with the mailing list of Reverend Moon. Strangely enough, the Koreans, and this is a Korean airplane that's going to be sacrificed, and Vagary worked for Reverend Moon. He worked for Larry MacDonald. He works with Roy Cohn of Western Goals and Young American for Freedom, and Robert Morris, making the high frontier space stations with Mr. Daniel Graham of the Defense Intelligence Agency and Fritz Kramer. This is the old gang from Munich, Germany, that worked with E. Howard Hunt and Richard Helms and Theodore Shackley and Edwin Wilson and George Corcola. They are experts at letting planes go down on their own, but they could go into an area and tamper with the machinery. Richard Vagary was one of the people that was giving the eulogy, and Litton Industries is involved with the flight panels and Melvin Belli. Another interesting factor in the September 19th, 1983 Newsweek is a sentence, part of this service that was allegedly for Larry MacDonald. And there's a quotation from Richard Vagary: "The problem isn't Jim Baker." That's the chief of staff for President Reagan. "The problem isn't Jim Baker," charged Richard Vagary, Viguere, the conservative king of direct mail campaigns. It's Ronald Reagan. Now, Richard Vagary is the guy who has been part of the YAF, as I say, the early terrifying far-right position that whips everybody up to a tithy and takes the assassinations and murders and then really blows them out of proportion to get everybody sufficiently scared. But the point is this, that George Bush was director of the CIA, and Ronald Reagan didn't die by the bullet when Hinckley was shooting there. They didn't have a backup that time. But Baker is CIA, and George Bush holds the key to all those other scandals that I mentioned last week or 2 weeks ago on the air that I refer to all the time, such as the Nugan-Hand Bank, the Gerald Ford Warren Commission secrets, to John Kennedy's murder, to the various military coups that we put into power. George Bush is a very powerful man as vice president. And now they're saying, oh, Baker's okay. He was the campaign manager for George Bush. So when the Korean Airline goes down, the far right is pushing Baker, which is Bush, as against Reagan. And Lynn Nofziger says, we'll write off the right when they're actually using the whole list of the Western Goals people, and I've had their names on the air and on printed sheets, and you've had that before. Now, I'm going to go into the motives, the 27 so far motives that they've achieved, but I want to go further into Larry MacDonald as number one investigation, because that is what I listed was the major investigation that could be diverted, and that is the one you're not getting any material about, because the stories coming out from the Los Angeles Times and the Los Angeles Herald Examiner are not wire services stories. They're not Associated Press, United Press, or Reuters. So you may correct me if I'm wrong, but tell me how many articles you have on Larry MacDonald and the Los Angeles Police Department. And I want to give you the chronology of that material. Incidentally, what Mary McGrory wrote September 14th, 1983, this is, I believe, the Washington Post. It was also in U.S. newspaper. She said, Andropov is in charge, and he's done the most wonderful thing the Kremlin has vindicated. The anti-communists, the memorial service for Representative Larry MacDonald of Georgia, chairman of the Birch Society, and the most conspicuous casualty, exploded with applause as the speakers rose to gloat. I told you so. They can no longer be called kooks, the Birch right-wingers, and extremists, as MacDonald once was. This is a quote. Now the whole world knows that the Soviets are subhuman and barbaric. The whole world knows. Then the article goes on to say what Andropov and company have done for U.S. hawks, the MX, the defense budget, and Ronald Reagan is beyond calculation. It seems that he's acting as chairman of Ronald Reagan's election campaign. 6 months ago, he was berated for being pictured, for showing the Soviets as monsters and having a low statesman's aura. He had rage and so forth, and he made himself a martyr in the cause of moderation when this came down. But now he's dragging his feet. He's not acting the warmonger, but the Soviet Union has done more for him and his re-election. Well, maybe he did it for himself. maybe the Soviet didn't do it for Ronald Reagan. He set this up himself, knowing that it went in that area, they would be blown away. One other article before I get to the Korean Airline story and the Los Angeles Police Department and Larry MacDonald. There was an obscene article in the newspapers on the profits of the Korean Airline. You know, as I said, there's 27 motors, but one of the most obscene was the stocks that went up so much, the warfare stocks that were dragging this summer. This was the LA Herald, September the 12th. What the Korean Airline shoot down means to defense stocks. And this is what it says. Aerospace stocks as a group hit a period of listlessness a few weeks ago as questions build up on the fate of the 1984 defense budget and the record deficit spending. The Soviets terminated the Korean Air Flight 007 and there was a rush. The dramatic news came. Within 3 market trading days following the news, the Korean jet had been blasted out of the sky. That's their words, blasted out of the sky. The nation's fifth largest defense contractors and the largest, Lockheed, experienced the largest gain of the group. Its stock jumped 8 points from 106 to 114. Martin Marietta was up 5 7/8. Boeing, General Dynamics, MacDonald Douglas, United Technologies grabbed 4 points each. And they have how the aerospace stocks performed since August. And they have August 30th, Rockwell, United Technology, Raytheon, Lockheed, so forth, and Boeing out of Seattle. Okay, the stock went up. If you own stock in that company, and as they say, when it was blasted out of the sky, the market went up. Do you think there's profit in war? Of course there is profit in war. The market looks beautifully. The article goes on to say there'll never be a slowing up now of budgets for defense. Now, the Korean Airline is very, very important. If people don't grasp what is happening, they're in deep trouble. It shows you how easily the mood can be galvanized by the news media to get you to react very positively against the Soviet Union, to hate those people. George Will, who the columnist from the far right, who is the fellow that coached the president so he'd be sure to win against Jimmy Carter so he could be doing what he's doing today. George Will said September 18th, the public mind is like wax. It's easiest to shape when heated. Ronald Reagan missed his opportunity after the Korean atrocity to raise public temperature to a healthy degree. That means blood boiling point. Hate them, buy the weapons, go into debt, stockpile, sacrifice everything this country has, raise the adrenaline, hate, hate, hate. He missed his chance because, as Will said, the public mind is like wax. And boy, is it ever. It just sticks together, and these early stories are important. Now, as I said, I mentioned the number one investigation, and I want to swing to that right now on part 2 of this broadcast, the importance of the Los Angeles Police Department investigation. Now, I mentioned in May how the Larry MacDonald Western Goals tapped into the police department and did 3 broadcasts on that. But I want to give the background up to May, then the story of Larry MacDonald, then the crash, then what happened in the newspaper just the last 2 weeks since the crash, how the case is developing. That is a very important story, and as I say, you're not getting it anywhere else, so we better do it here. We'll take a 1-minute break and come back and do that, and this is Mae Brussell, KAZU FM, Pacific Grove, California. This is Mae Brussell, broadcast number 615, September 19th, 1983. It's side 2. We're emanating from Pacific Grove, California, KAZU FM, Pacific Grove, California. For those of you who hear these broadcasts every week, if you do not have the sheets that accompany the tapes, some people subscribe to the tapes, others hear these off the air, you can write to me at P.O. Box 22511. Carmel 93922. Send self-addressed stamped envelope and tell me which broadcast they're usually numbered, or the date you heard it, or the subject matter, because you hear them at different times in different cities. Some of them are months later, and the time or date doesn't matter. They should hold up for all time, and I hope they do. But just tell me what it was that you heard that interested you, and I'll send you the sources of information for that. And if you want to subscribe, I can tell you how to get them in case you miss any of the broadcasts and you listen to them regularly. Now, I mentioned the reasons for getting rid of Larry MacDonald and the interconnecting links of Larry MacDonald to various trials and investigations that his Western goals would be attached to. I mentioned that 2 weeks ago. And as I say, number one on the list was the Lynx investigation of Los Angeles Police Department. Now, briefly, I'll give you a rundown of what happened in Los Angeles with the police department up to when this story really broke, and then what's happened, as I say, since Larry MacDonald died. Because the investigation is still going on. It's so huge, it may out Watergate, and it should be. The Los Angeles Police Department was the one that Louis Tackwood wrote about in his book, The Glass House Tapes. That is available, I believe, in a paperback, and it tells you about their operations and departments. This is a brief rundown that affects the immediate airline story that we're talking about now. In 1970, the Public Disorder Intelligence Division, it's short PDID, Public Disorder Intelligence Division, was created by Ed Davis. He was chief of police of Los Angeles. He was police chief around there when Robert Kennedy was murdered at the Ambassador Hotel, and a pile of other movie stars and rock stars and so forth. And this disorder intelligence was to infiltrate law-abiding people who hadn't committed crimes, and then the police agents were involved as provocateurs, doing bombings, murders, being 6 feet away from a woman that was stabbed, an agent provocateur hired by the police department, and killing, as Louis Tackwood said they did for them, and so forth. The police chief set this up to discredit a group of approximately 200 organizations and link them all to communists and have information on these various people, public officials, actors, writers, and this was going on in police stations all over the United States. The most notorious, the Red Squad in New York. John Reese worked with them from Western Goals. But Los Angeles was the area I was interested in because I live in California, and Reagan was governor here for 8 years, so I was getting a really good view just being here and taking the California papers. In 1970, the police chief had the nerve to form this group. Of course, the Vietnam War was going on. There were protests, and people were not supposed to oppose the war. Now, in the chronology that the Los Angeles Times printed January the 19th, 1983, they jump conveniently to April 1975. That's a very good history. They say April 1975, nearly 2 million outdated intelligence files were ordered destroyed by the Civilian Police Commission. Can you imagine 2 million files? We can't get these figures far from our head. I want you to remember them because they're very important. That many files were ordered destroyed in 1975. That was the time of the Senate Watergate hearings were winding down, when Senator Church was doing his work, when Ronald Reagan was working with the Rockefeller Commission to cover up the murders around the world and in the United States, of John Kennedy particularly. And it was the time when the Pike report was coming out, the House of Representatives, the Senate, the appointed commissions were investigating all these dirty tricks all over the world. So by 1975, they said, destroy these files on civilians. These are civilians that didn't commit crimes. Now, in between 1970 and 75, they leave that out. 1972 was when E. Howard Hunt and James McCord and G. Gordon Liddy and Henry Kissinger and the White House plumbers were working with the Beverly Hills Chief of Police, Jack Eggers, and with the Los Angeles Police Department. That was the time when the hotel, the offices, rather, of Dr. Fielding were burglarized, and Elmer Davis was sent to prison for 3 years by the Beverly Hills Police, and the White House plumbers did it. They were very active, the Beverly Hills, Los Angeles Police, with their disinformation, their Squad 19. It was James McCord with the military unit I wrote about in my first article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? A lot on the police department. Well, the chronology jumps to 1975, when all these various agencies in Washington were saying, get rid of these files, and by 1975, they ordered destroyed 2 million outdated files. Okay. 1976, a year later, the Police Commission adopted guidelines to restrict the information that the police department can keep on innocent people attending various meetings and so forth. August 76, 1 year later, Connie Milazzo, Milazzo, infiltrated the Progressive Labor Party, and she was exposed as a police agent, standing a few feet away from a man that was murdered, and the political spying on her role continued. It showed that there was a violation of the guidelines. They weren't supposed to be doing it. June 1978, there was a coalition against police abuse. The LAPD has a death squad just identical to the 3A in Argentina, or the Guerrillas of Christ in Spain, or in Bolivia, the Christ the King, the Killers in Spain, the Guerrillas, or in Argentina, Alliance, the Anti-Communist Alliance Against Communism. There are death squads in Los Angeles, and they are horrendous. So there was a coalition against police abuse. It was the first of 6 lawsuits against the police with the unconstitutional infringement on the rights of people to organize. By July 78, a month later, the Citizens Commission on Police Repression, an anti-police spying group, released a list of 200 organizations that had intelligence targets. They were targeted by the agency, by the police department. They had 200 targets at the time, constitutional groups of people meeting. I even saw an FBI report of mine from Freedom of Information. I went to talk to the Kiwanis Club one day. That's the kind of stuff they put in it. 200 targets, 2 million files that they had, order destroyed, and they find out 3 years later they have 200 organizations still targeted. By April of 1980, a year and a half later, there were more disclosures of the police connections, and they started to have tighter guidelines. By May of 80, a month later, the police documents obtained through lawsuits showed that the undercover people were still working and gathering information. And they not only got new information, but the other was supposed to be destroyed. November 1981, the police documents revealed that an undercover officer informed superiors about private meetings that he knew about where Mayor Bradley met with members of the United Farm Workers in 1970. He's the mayor, and the farm workers pick our fruits and vegetables that they send all over the world, but the mayor has to have a spy there taking bugging or present who reports what the mayor of Los Angeles says to farm workers who happen to live around Los Angeles area also. By February 82, police intelligence documents said that a group was created to protest the controversial shooting of Eula, E-U-L-I-A, Love, and it was infiltrated by undercover officers who organized a march to City Hall. And these undercover officers were writing anti-police material to show that the people that objected to this poor black woman who was gunned down, I think she owed a gas bill of like $8 that was paid, or she had the check in her hand. They gunned her down, and then they had people in the police department writing letters against the police to show how vicious the black people are when she was killed, and everyone defends the police then. So that was going on. In March 82, there were more disclosures of police intelligence abuse, and a new third set of guidelines was set up. By April 82, the city paid an activist, Seymour Myerson, a $27,500 settlement, 5-year lawsuit that they didn't like his politics. He wasn't a communist. They didn't like what he said or wrote or letters to the editor. They didn't like him. The city settled it. It was the first time they settled a spying suit, $27,500. October 82, police documents were prepared for the Office of Chief of Police, saying that the intelligence information long described as garbage by the department, those 2 million files that they said are totally worthless, were being channeled not only in the police department, but up the chain of command to the higher police officers, not the lower ones, but the law-abiding citizens, writers, actors, rock musicians, people that protest all kinds of oppression or police murders. It was going higher up, so then a second investigation on that, on whether or not Chief of Police Gates misled them on the spying case. The probe was investigated, and he had been lying. They did have these papers, and after all these investigations, they were still moving him higher up. Now, you may wonder what this has to do with Flight 007, but we're going to get to that soon and tie this all together. By November the 8th, 1982, The Los Angeles school superintendent, Jerry Halverson, Halverson, said that police agents from the public disorder group offered him dossiers on school employees, like he could fire them if they were left or if they didn't like war, they were in favor of abortion. Teachers could be fired, and he reported that the police commission had these files that they were ordered destroyed, but they were using them for jobs to blacklisting, just like they did in the McCarthy years. It's still going on today, and it'll be on tomorrow. By November 1982, Mr. Gates, the chief of police, asked the district attorney's office to investigate whether these files that were originally ordered to be destroyed had been removed from the police department where he was keeping them. They were illegally kept, and then they were illegally removed. By December of 1982, they found that an undercover officer had infiltrated these various parties and had sex with these people. There was a bloody clash and violence, and that the police, in fact, had been an active part of this, and they wanted to circumvent the guidelines, and because of the controversy or investigation, they were moving the files, the intelligent files had been removed from the police department so that the police commission couldn't investigate, that they had gone higher up. Now, January the 4th, the beginning of this year, 1983, the grand jury convened and found that Detective J.S. Paul, the one I described on broadcast, this goes back a while back to the Larry MacDonald story when it first broke, May 30th, broadcast 599. J. Paul told his superiors that he took the sensitive intelligence records to his home years after they were ordered destroyed, and that a search of his home turned out dossiers on police commission members, on various organizations and people and judges in Los Angeles. And January the 7th, J. Paul led them to more than 50 boxes in a Long Beach garage that they were told to be burned years ago. Not only were they burned, but they were going to hire us up. When the higher-up were being investigated, he took them home. And by January the 10th, 1983, a councilman, Zev Yaroslavsky, Yaroslavsky, said that a police intelligence agent told him that his name was on those files. And by January the 12th, 1983, the police commission met, and they had information January the 17th, 83, about the connections of these people investigating judges such as Jerry Pack, and that there were 3 decades of public life in these files, 30 years. That goes back to 1950s to Senator Joe McCarthy, and John Reese and Louise Reese and the whole gang were still active. Well, what happened, I started collecting the articles. I have many of them. I have over 200 articles just since January on this story, put in chronological order in 2 notebooks. But when the story broke and they found these were in the garage of J. Paul, it was that broadcast that I did May 24th that told you that they turned up in the garage being put into a computer run by Larry MacDonald, a Democrat out of Georgia, the president of the Birch Society, into an organization called Western Goals that has the top military, the organized crime syndicate, and files going back 50 years. One article that January of 83, the first of this year, described some of the organizations, 200 organizations that are involved. Here's a few of them. The Coalition Against Police Abuse, the Alliance for Survival. Isn't that terrible? The Communist Party USA, the Black Panthers, the Teamsters for Democratic Union, the Peace and Freedom, the Progressive Labor, the Greater Watts on Justice Center. Isn't that terrible? Scientology, La Raza Unida, that's the Chicano group. The People's College of Law, Democratic Socialist Organization, the Venceremos Brigade, the anti-nuclear groups, all of them. The American Friends Service Committee, the Southern Christian Leadership, United Farm Workers, Local 80, the Civil Liberties Union, the Community Relations Conference, the Juvenile Justice Center, the Socialist Workers' Party, the new Mount Pleasant Baptist Church Women For, which is a women's organization. I'm just giving you about 20 names. There were 200 organizations and 2 million files going back 30 years. That's a pretty long time. Now, the Larry MacDonald air crash went down September the 1st. The president didn't go to the services. He disassociated himself. I mentioned 2 weeks before the crash went down, on the front page of the Washington Post, August the 18th, 1983, was the first mention that Larry MacDonald and Western Goals would have to go out to Los Angeles to testify about how their $100,000 computer tied in with the files that were ordered destroyed 10 years ago that were used by the highest police officers that go into the Birch Society, into Roy Cohn's crime syndicate, into Edward Teller's anti-nuclear protests against his lousy bombs. Now, after the Larry MacDonald crash, September the 1st, the first public links to Western Goals that I saw was September 13th, just 2 weeks later. ACLU wins a look at the new cache of PDID data. That's C-A-C-H-E, not C-A-S-H. Okay, it says the Superior Court judge in Los Angeles ordered the police department to investigate not only J. Paul, but another policeman, PDID from that department, Lieutenant Thomas Scheidecker, S-C-H-E-I-D-E-C-K-E-R, has been named along with, there's 131 plaintiffs suing this class action suit. Scheidecker, another policeman, had 7 boxes in his home of 10,000 pages of documents, and he doesn't want to reveal what they are. He says, many are personal in nature. They cover a wide variety of subjects. When I was in L.A., I saw the play Chaplin, and there's a scene there about his making the movie The Great Dictator and being kicked out of this country, and then he returns to the United States, as maybe you know, in 1972 to get an Academy Award and some recognition in Hollywood. Well, there are FBI reports that there were cameras behind Charlie Chaplin on the stage that photographed every person in the audience who wanted to see Charlie Chaplin in 1972. That makes you an enemy of the state. They can entrap you or any other thing. If you are sympathetic to Charlie Chaplin in 1972, that is in these files. Now, Scheidecker has hired an attorney. He had many of the boxes. He had 10,000 pages of his own, and J. Paul has 180 boxes of material. They're now microfilming it. See, at first it was 30 and then 40. Now it's 180. The L.A. Herald said that Olson, the judge, granted an order impelling the officials from Virginia-based Western Goals, a right-wing nonprofit foundation attempting to create a database for internal security information to give depositions. They're trying to get a database. This is 30 years of files, 2 million from L.A. alone that go into their computer, and 200 organizations. Okay? It says Linda Guell, G-U-E-L-L, and John Reese of Western Goals have been ordered to report about their group. They'll give depositions to the grand jury October 4th and 5th. That'll be in 2 weeks. The article in the Herald says this is going to establish the so-called abuses of the police department were not frolicsome or isolated. They are inextricably connected to the political objectives and activities of the most extremist right-wing element of this society. That's why Ronald Reagan wasn't at those services and isn't talking about Paul. The article in the Herald said Paul refused to answer questions of his connections to Western Goals and their links to right-wing groups among the top officials, including Chief of Police Daryl Gates. Another story in the L.A. Times, September the 14th, the next day, Alexandria, Virginia. The judge refused to squash a subpoena to bring the head of Western Goals, an anti-communist group with computerized data on police subversives with the help of Los Angeles Police Department. They refused to squash the indictment against Linda Guell, the director. They said she may be even a defendant in this case. Now, she tried to get out because she said her testimony isn't necessary material. See, the necessary material would be Larry MacDonald, right? But he's dead. She can't get out of it. The judge says go to L.A. This case says if she's called to testify, she'll use the 5th. You know how Joe McCarthy didn't like the 5th when he asked questions. It says J. Paul ran the computer operation from his wife's law office in Long Beach using $100,000 worth of equipment purchased by Western Goals, founded in 1979 by Larry MacDonald, who also was chairman of the John Birch Society and is one of the 269 that went down. This Jewel, she will invoke her Fifth Amendment right against incrimination before the grand jury. Western Goals and his director, J. Paul, and Ms. Jewel must testify. J. Paul's wife, Ann Love, will be called and to explain. She signed, Larry MacDonald signed a $30,000 contract with a police officer, J. Paul's wife, to maintain the computer spying in her Long Beach law office. I think you get the point. I brought it out when this story first broke. The investigation is going on. Another article about the lawyers in this case. They have hired 4 lawyers for the police department. Now 131 people are in the lawsuit. There are 50 policemen involved from the PDID department as defendants. All of the defendants in the department except J. Paul, directly linked to Western Goals, and Mr. Scheidecker will have the same law office represented by Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher. That's the law office of Ronald Reagan, Howard Hughes, the entire COINTEL military spy Lockheed espionage establishment. Lockheed was the home base in California and in Georgia of Larry MacDonald. The law offices carrying this are Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher for the 50 policemen, and there are separate lawyers for J. Paul and Mr. Scheidecker because of conflict of interest. Now, this is a story that will not be closed up quickly, even though the preceding part has not been on the wire services. I've tried to keep you up on it, and I have not even delved into the LAPD articles or files because it broke into 2 sections. One, the killing, the death squads, the spying, the documents that have been kept and preserved. Then the second part was in May of 1983, when all of a sudden Larry MacDonald and Western Goals get into this, into a full-page section, of the LA Times, of the links, because when you get the military, that you don't have to have the Army, or these are really working for the CIA and the Defense Department. All you have to have is all the local police snooping, infiltrating, setting these names, preserving these documents, then sending them through this $100,000 computer and $30,000 a year into a office in Long Beach, back again to the top military like Admiral Moore, who is the close liaison of Henry Kissinger, the fellow who was partying up in Vail, Colorado with Gerald Ford. All of their dirty tricks, if this goes back 30 years, the dirty tricks of Gerald Ford and the Warren Commission and the California people who were subpoenaed by Jim Garrison to go back involved with the murder of John Kennedy, and Reagan was governor and he wouldn't set them back, or the following people involved with the Robert Kennedy assassination, or the Sharon Tate massacre that was set up by the police department, or the SLA, the killing of those people by the SWAT team that was part of Stanford Research, and the Los Angeles Police Department, and Jonestown, and the links of Los Angeles and Jim Jones to the Los Angeles Police Department and up to Sacramento to the law enforcement. Now, keeping in mind that there is an investigation on all this, and that your files, 2 million of it, have been saved, and 200 organizations for 30 years, and how MacDonald's organization was set up in 1979 to transfer it right back into the right-wing Senator Joe McCarthy, Georgetown spy, the Michael Ledines and the Claire Sterlings and the Robert Mosses and all the liars who talk about terrorism, pump it into their machines and set people up for real terrorism. What I was saying is that one section I had watching the LAPD for, ever since I've done my research, and since those people were not extradited to the murder of John Kennedy. And then in January, when these police file stories broke, I have all of those going from January, and it's almost a year now of the police files. Then in May, in the middle of the year, enters the Larry MacDonald file. So you have the police and then the Larry MacDonald. And then Larry MacDonald branches off to the military and the mob and Roy Cohn and back to Permindex and the Borgheses and the Murder Incorporated and that group with MacDonald as the kingpin. But then the third element that I did want to do this summer, and I'll be getting into it shortly, is the Olympic Games coming in Los Angeles. The fight between the security of the Olympic Games, and I mention this over and over again, and the reason I refer to the possibility of a Reichstag or overthrowing the government or taking it in a national emergency is that the Olympics and the security is being handled by the FBI and the CIA, and these files could be used to round up people, just as when the convention was moved in 1972 from San Diego to Miami, people like Frank Sturgis, who worked with those gentlemen whose names I mentioned to you in the first half of this broadcast, those people, he had a tax-deductible church where he was stockpiling weapons. And in Texas, when Officer Tippit was killed, a man who shot him went to a church down below the church stockpiled weapons. The gun running of these people is hidden behind the Vatican cloaks, behind the Israeli synagogues. The point is that churches are sacrosanct, and in the churches are the weapons and so forth. The tax-deductible church for Frank Sturgis, who worked for these people. So the Olympic Games security is a factor. I wish, because of the Korean air flight, that there would be no Olympic Games. I wish they had a party and nobody came, because then they couldn't blame the Russians, but they would find some way, say they didn't come, so sour grapes, they dropped a bomb or a germ bomb, and therefore we have to round everybody up. Even they stayed away because they were going to create violence and didn't want to be caught. Whether they're there or not there, the script would probably be to blame them. Could they get away with it? Of course they could. When I see the reaction of the news media and listen to the talk shows about Flight 269 without a piece of evidence of the massive spying that was going on, I believe that the mind can be set like wax with the very first print, and in the heat of the anger, the opinions are made, then later things take on a different aura, different appearance than what they were the first day or two after any particular tragedy takes place. Incidentally, if you want to order some appropriate T-shirts or calendars or cups for the year, there's a George Orwell's Society, the 1984 group. Write to 1984, or Orwell, P.O. Box 750, Lancaster, Pennsylvania 17603. You can get a shirt that says Big Brother is Watching You, 1984. You can get a 1984 Elect George Orwell President. You can get a 1984 calendar. You can order buttons, Big Brother is Watching You, or coffee mugs or bumper stickers for your car. So I think we should say Larry MacDonald is watching you, or Roy Cohn is watching you, or Henry Kissinger. Call it the Kissinger 1984. But anyway, this story of the airplane crash, I'll go into more detail next week. Larry Flynt had a full-page ad in many newspapers, the LA Times, the Washington Post, on life, liberty, and the pursuit of Flight 007. And the full page begins, why was Congressman Larry MacDonald on board Flight 007? Next week, we'll get right to that. I'll share that with you. I went up to the offices of Larry Flynt. I happened to be in L.A. and wanted to do a story for Hustler on Larry MacDonald, the LAPD, Murder Incorporated, and what Western Goals is. They told me to send an outline, and they would consider that story. So maybe we can get it out in a magazine like Hustler. Larry Flynt should know what happened. He was shot in Georgia, not far from Marietta, Georgia, which is the home base of Larry MacDonald, the head of Western Goals. Their offices are in Virginia. It's part of the CIA, but home base for Congress is Georgia. In the meantime, we'll take a break for 1 week now because the time is up. These tapes are only an hour. Unfortunately, I'd like to do 2 or 3, but that would get too expensive. We'll continue more on the flight. But I think it was very important, if they were going to spy on the Soviet Union and use it in conjunction with a satellite and a spy plane, put Larry on there. They knew it was the 30th anniversary of the Korean War and that he had to go to Korea or was invited to Korea, and it was arranged to go to celebrate with the great anti-communists this event. So this way, a very important man involved with, these are not simple files. You wouldn't blow them up for one piece of paper to testify. We're talking about 200 organizations, 30 years of file on 2 million people in L.A. that had been ordered legally to be destroyed and were used not by the underlings, but the chiefs of police and the former chief of staff, Admiral Moore, and the entire military could get into their hands through that massive computer in Long Beach. We'll do more on that next week. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell, KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California.